Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathy Nguyen from Associations Forum, and welcome to our webinar that we're delivering in partnership with AgriFutures. We're doing a capacity building program for emerging industries. This webinar is the first of a series of 6 for those emerging industries that have associations. So we're going to spend a couple of hours talking about association boards and what their roles and responsibilities are. Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping. As we go, we do like to run these sessions in an interactive way. So if you do have questions or comments, please interrupt us. You can do that. You can type in a question in the chat box, or you can just speak up. We don't have a lot of people online, so that's fine in a group of this size. The other thing to note is that my colleague Steve Patterson will be co-presenting with me, and Steve and I are not lawyers, so please do not take anything we say as legal advice. The content we're delivering to you is based on our experience working with hundreds of associations over the years, and we'll talk a little bit more about our business and what we do. Now, I'd like to introduce Laura Skipworth, who's the Manager of Emerging Industries at AgriFutures, just to say hi to everyone and introduce herself. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Kathy, and thanks everyone who's joined online today. I just thought it'd be a good opportunity to give a bit of background to this capacity building program and why we're doing it, and for those who might not know who AgriFutures are and our Emerging Industries program, what we do. So AgriFutures is one of Australia's rural research and development corporations, and we have a unique mandate that in one of those parts allows us to invest in new and emerging industries. Industries that are not levied or don't pay an R&D levy, and our sort of the way we look at them at the moment is sort of high growth potential and mainly under a $10 million GBP, but with high growth potential to grow beyond that figure through RD&E investment. And one of those components we see is really important is capacity building and making sure those within our emerging industries have the skills and knowledge and ability to help drive the industries forward and drive growth in those industries. And we've identified that we've got sort of 2 types of emerging industries, ones that have industry associations and ones that are still quite new and don't necessarily have a formal association yet. So we've decided to put together this capacity building program. We've just wrapped up part 1. So you may have seen part 1 was for those who didn't have an industry association, and if they wanted to, how they might go about that. And then this is the start of part 2, which is those who do have industry associations, and our aim is really to strengthen the skills within industry to make sure associations can really help the growth and development of that particular industry. So I manage the emerging industries portfolio at AgriFutures, and if you have any questions about AgriFutures or the portfolio itself, feel free to reach out. I'll pop my contact details in the chat box, so you can reach out to me if I'm not in the webinar, or if it's at a later date that you have a question. So hopefully you get something out of this webinar, and if you're attending the next 5, and yeah, we'd love to also make sure we get your feedback on the content and what you've got out of it. So thanks, Kathy.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. Okay, Steve, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. My name is Steve Patterson. My previous experience, which is relevant to this discussion today, I was CFO and Company Secretary for Australian Hearing, which is the large government hearing provider. So I had intimate interaction on board level, stakeholder level, and government interaction as well. And more recently, I've been the CFO and Company Secretary for AMA New South Wales, Australian Medical Association, the doctors, providing governance, finance, risk registers for all the doctors and their representatives on the board, and Audit and Risk Committee. So in the association field, which is quite relevant to what we're just discussing today.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So if I can tell you a little bit about Associations Forum and who we are. We're a business that was started in 2004, and we work exclusively with associations. And by associations, we generally mean not-for-profit organisations, often with members, and we help either the volunteers of those associations or the staff of those associations, whether it's govern the association better or run the association better. And we have a suite of services, including events, conferences, workshops like these, as well as an advisory team where we do planning days, constitution reviews, board training sessions, etc. So in Australia, there's pretty much an association for everything. And in the last year and a half that we've, in this extraordinary year that we've had, we've really seen the importance of the role of associations in helping their members through the pandemic and the crisis, whether it's to provide information, to be the voice of the industry to decision makers, or just generally be there to support their members. So we're very fortunate to be working in this sector, and we truly believe that associations advance the world. Okay, just some stats. So we've been around a long time, and we've done a lot of planning days, governance sessions, etc. Now with the AgriFutures program, so after the series of webinars, there will be follow-up assistance available for those industry associations that are interested, and that might be, for example, the facilitation of a planning day with your board, or a closer look at your constitution. Now, I just want to launch an anonymous poll before we get started on the content. So, my knowledge of association governance is, and please choose one, limited, fair, good, excellent. Okay, I'll just give it 3 more seconds. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. And I'll just share the results, and just try and remember what you chose. We'll do another poll at the end. Okay. Throughout the session, there are certain terms and words that we'll be using, and I just want to clarify. So we will refer to a constitution, which is the governing document of any association. And in your association, it might be called rules, or it might be called memorandum and articles of association, which is actually an outdated term. And every association has a governing body. We will refer to it as a board, and the individuals on that body, directors, so board of directors. But again, in your association, it might be called a council, committee, management committee, executive committee, etc. There are various names, but we're talking about the same thing. Associations obviously have members, and those that are fortunate and rich enough will have staff, and the senior staff person we will refer to as the CEO, and sometimes they're called EO or ED. So these are the areas we're going to cover in the webinar, and we're going to aim to take a short stretch break in the middle. So we'll see how we go. Oh, excuse me. I don't know if that popped up. So firstly, let's look at the legal framework that associations work in. Associations usually start with a group of volunteers who are dedicated to a common cause or sector or industry, and they might get together and do a few projects or run a few activities. And at this stage, it might be just an informal group or an unincorporated association. Now, this group might look to formalise all the things that they're doing, and they might incorporate, which is the second part of this AgriFutures program for those associations that have already incorporated. And some of the benefits of incorporating is that it does limit the liability of the individuals involved because the corporate veil is created. And so if things do go wrong, it's the legal entity, the association, that is sued and not the individuals involved. And a few other benefits. Obviously, it provides credibility and legitimacy, ease of succession from member to member and director to director. And a new independent entity is created and is more than a gathering of interests. So when you incorporate an association in Australia, there are two main ways to do it. The first is as a company limited by guarantee under the Commonwealth Corporations Act. In that case, generally the regulator is ASIC, which is the corporate regulator. And then the second way to incorporate is as an incorporated association under one of the state or territory associations incorporation acts. And there's one in every state and territory. And in that case, the regulator would be Fair Trading, Department of Consumer Affairs, etc. Every state or territory has a different name for that particular regulator of associations. Now, companies limited by guarantee would have the name limited, the word limited after their name, and incorporated associations would usually have the word Inc. or incorporated after their name. Some associations are special in that they've been set up either by royal charter or their own acts of parliament. A couple of examples. Tonight, Steve and I will be talking to the Board of Girl Guides, New South Wales. So they've been set up by their own act of parliament, for example, but they're a minority group. After you formally incorporate it, whether as limited or Inc., and the association exists for what is considered a charitable purpose, and there's 12 charitable purposes, then the association might apply to become a charity with the ACNC, which is the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. And just to give you an indication of numbers, so we think there's probably around 30,000 companies limited by guarantee and maybe 150,000 incorporated associations. And the ACNC has, I think, nearly 60,000 charities on their register. To give all that some context, we've looked up the participating associations on this webinar. And so, for example, you can see we've got some companies limited by guarantee, SA, Queensland, New South Wales Associations Incorporation Acts. And the association names with limited, obviously companies limited by guarantee, and with Incs are under the state acts. Now, B Industry of WA, I actually couldn't find that on the Australian Business Register, but there is a B Industry Council Western Australia Limited. So hopefully we've got that right, but that's fine. And then a few more organisations there. Okay, so we've got a good spread. Couldn't find any charities, which is fine. Now, generally, if the association is small and poor and operates within one state, then incorporating under the Associations Incorporation Act is appropriate. Now, most associations do start off under one of the state acts, and then when they get to a certain size, or if they expand nationally and do business across Australia beyond that original state, they will either need to transfer to being a company limited by guarantee or get an ARBN, which is Australian Registered Business Number administered by ASIC. What we're finding over the years is that the state acts are being updated to include duties of board members consistent with what's outlined in the Corporations Act. So the principles of governance are merging, and they apply regardless of whether you're an incorporated association or a company limited by guarantee. So with governance, we say build upon solid foundations. And what we mean by that is make sure the association is properly incorporated under the relevant legislation, and then building on that, that it has a constitution that sets up the appropriate governance framework and also the membership structures, and is clear on the mission and why the organisation exists. So flowing on from the Constitution spells out, how the board will be composed and, how people get onto the board, how long they're there for, etc. And so what you want is a board that does understand its duties and its roles, is collegiate, and is not distracted by preventable governance problems, which we will talk about in this session. And when affordable, a competent CEO can be hired, who's in charge of achieving the plan and is supported by a wise and vigilant board. So with the foundations in place, the association can then focus on achieving what its mission is and helping its members. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Kathy. Picking up on Kathy's slide, which people have filled in, governance is critical to an organisation, and the fact that people are still learning about it, it's something that you develop over time, and it's important in any stage of a business. So corporate governance is really the way organisations are directed and controlled. Board members and the board directors are responsible for governance of organisations. Members' role in governance is electing the directors and electing and appointing auditors. There is a famous case we've listed down the bottom there, the Cadbury case, who was actually the chair of that famous group over in the UK, who developed a great code on governance, which is basically what we rolled out in Australia as well. So that's the background. So firstly, touching on fiduciary duties. In a definition of the fiduciary is someone who takes on a duty to act on behalf of the members and gives rise to a relationship and a confidence on that one. So really important that if you are appointed as a director, you're assuming that fiduciary duty to act on behalf of the organisation. And what must they do under fiduciary is really key. They must act honestly and in good faith, and always in the best interests of the organisation. That is key to everything in governance, that you are representing the organisation and your interests should not be above the interest of the organisation. Generally, they should not make a profit unless they inform the board of the reasons and the circumstances making that profit, and ensuring that it's not at the detriment of the organisation they're representing as a director. They must always ensure that their conflicts of interest are declared and not impacting on their role as a director, nor impacting on the organisation as well. As we said, the organisation must always come first. What the directors should always do is act in good faith in the best interest of the organisation and for proper purpose. It's really important that proper purpose is really ensuring that any information the directors come across, they use it for the purpose of being on the board. They don't take it outside the meeting and use it for personal gain or setting up competing organisations or businesses. Duty of care and diligence. It's really important that the test is covered in this space where what would a reasonable person would exercise. A care is important that they don't do anything that would harm the organisation, but more importantly is around diligence. The fact that they might receive board papers and they don't read them until prior to the meeting, or don't read them at all, would show that diligence isn't in place. Obviously, board members need to be acting in due diligence with, first of all, reading the board papers, ensuring that they understand what the organisation is up to, and being prepared. The very important part is what would a reasonable person expect. The fact that they lack any skills, particularly in the finance area, doesn't exempt them from being due diligent. They need, if they don't have finance expertise, they need to ask the board to assume that finance reporting and get experts into the area, or ask questions. There's no such thing in a board meeting as a dumb question. Board members should always ask the questions they need to ask. As a former CFO, it's important to get questions. Then you know board members have read board papers, and you actually have a good interaction and good strategy by getting asked questions, because board members have come with a diverse set of skills. So questions actually could lead to great actions as well. And obviously, the board members must assess the business objectively. Okay. The really key that everyone would be aware of and is important when assuming directors' responsibilities is understanding the organisation's financial status. The board and all the directors have a responsibility to ensure that to prevent insolvent trading. So what the organisation needs to ensure and report to the board is their financial position at regular intervals, and usually that is at board meetings or more urgent at other times, and ensuring that the organisation doesn't incur any debts which they cannot pay for. So the really important part is there that an organisation would be expected to pay all debts as and when they fall due. So for example, we've seen cases come up where directors haven't acted in that regard, and that might be something like they enter into a huge marketing campaign which they know they have no money to pay for, with the aim of getting them out of debt, but actually putting the business into debt that they can't pay for if the campaign doesn't succeed. So there's been a number of cases on ensuring that the directors are aware of the position and don't continue to trade if they're insolvent. And importantly, as a director, there is cases where they can be sued for trading as an insolvency. So it actually can go back against the director's own assets. So really key. As we've sort of touched on, is the improper use of information to gain advantage for themselves, and more importantly, to disadvantage the organisation. As I said, a case is making sure that they don't receive confidential information that they use to grow an independent business, which is a competitor to the organisation. I won't go through all the different acts or in that, but that is the summary basically. The really important one, and the one that is very, very much in the press always, is the declaration of conflicts of interest. Each director has a fundamental duty to act in the best interest of the organisation and declare any material personal interests. All directors will at various times have conflicts of interest because they're probably appointed to a board because they have expertise in that particular area, industry. So they actually do engage with other people that are in that industry. It's really how you handle that conflict of interest and declare that, because all directors must ensure that decisions made at board level are made impartially. So the really crux of the matter is actually making sure if you have a conflict of interest would be declare. Usually it is an agenda item at the beginning of every board meeting, conflicts of interest. When a director also starts with an organisation, they will complete a register of any conflicts of interest. And at the beginning of each board meeting, they'll be asked if there's any updates to that. So we've been designing conflict of interest registers and also doing papers on conflict of interest. During these COVID times, we've spent a bit of time on policies. So if anyone's not sure of those things, we can actually provide some information or templates as well. Feel free to ask any questions throughout this session. I know conflicts of interest is always an engaging one, and it's really important to each case to be judged on its merit, but with the overriding clause being that the board members should always act in the interests of the organisation, not themselves. Okay. The other really key part is when directors are appointed to boards, they're appointed usually because they represent a group or a particular membership base. It's important once they assume that directorship, they need to be actually acting in the best interests of the board that they're on, and they need to disengage themselves from interests of outside organisations. So it's really important that they actually assume the role of director on behalf of the board, not on behalf of a lobby group or any organisations that's trying to actually drive the business in a particular direction. They should always be acting in the best interest of the organisation.
Thanks, Steve. All right, now let's have a look at some key governance documents. This is a list of typical governance documents for any association. There's 12 there. So first is legislation. Obviously know how you're incorporated, and there might be other relevant legislation to your association. The second is the constitution, which is the governing document of the organisation. And in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about constitutions. Constitutions are often supported by bylaws or regulations, which are optional. The difference between a constitution and the bylaws is that the constitution can only be changed by the members, usually via a special resolution passed at a general meeting, whereas bylaws can be made and changed by the board. Associations commonly have a governance charter or a board charter, which is a little bit like, I guess, a manual board for the board, and might cover things like the role of the chair versus the role of the CEO, expected behaviours of directors, board meeting protocols, etc. 5, 6, and 7 are linked. So you start with the statements of purpose, which comes from the objects clause in the Constitution. Okay, so it might be called a mission statement or statements of purpose. And then 6, which is your plan, is the document that states how you're going to achieve that purpose. And then the budget is the financial plan. It's helpful to have a list of board members and office bearers and how long they've been on the board and what their day jobs are. Staff organisation chart, if you're lucky enough to have staff, and then minutes. So legally, you have to keep minutes of board meetings and general meetings. And in the later slides, we'll talk a little bit more about minutes and meetings. Associations publish an annual report which communicates their achievements and challenges to the members and the stakeholders, and acknowledge the efforts of volunteers. And included in that annual report is usually the audited financial report. An interesting exercise that associations can do is to track their financial history for emerging industries that might, it might not go back 10 years, but it might go back 5 years. And then you can see if you're stagnant, if you're growing, does it go up and down every couple of years, etc. So constitutions, not the most exciting documents, but extremely important. So it is legally, it is a contract between the association and the members, and it's basically the association's mini law. The legislation that the association is incorporated under will determine what needs to go in the constitution. The general rule is that if something is important enough that the members should have a say, then it should go in the constitution. And then the more prescriptive stuff can go in the bylaws. So constitutions should be clear and relevant, not ambiguous and operational. When we review constitutions, this is what we look at. Is it logical, consistent, not ambiguous about, especially when it comes to who can be a member or who are the voting members. This should be very clear in the Constitution, as well as the board composition and how directors are appointed or elected. It needs to include the required tax rules to be eligible for tax benefits, and we'll talk more about that. We suggest constitutions should be reviewed every few years, and a review doesn't mean that something is changed. It just means that someone's read it and to check that it is still current and still reflects what you're doing, etc. The law specifies how the constitution can be changed, and usually through most of the acts, that's by the members passing a special resolution, which is a 75% majority of the votes cast. And constitutions should be enabling documents. So they should enable the board to achieve the mission, and it shouldn't restrict or hinder boards from doing things. And it might do that if, for example, it is too prescriptive or it sets up cumbersome governance structures. 5 key components in any constitution. The first is the purpose or objects clause, which is explaining the legal reason why the association exists. The second is around members. So who can be a member, who gets voting rights, how they stop being members, how you can expel a member, etc. There's usually a few clauses about general meetings, which is a formal meeting of the members. And for most associations, they would hold one general meeting a year, which is the AGM, annual general meeting. And so the Constitution will spell out, the notice period, voting procedure, who can call a general meeting, etc. 4 directors or the board, as we talked about, and then 5 is procedural matters, including winding up. Now, when we use the term not-for-profit organisation, what it actually means is it's all to do with tax. So the legislation doesn't define what a not-for-profit is, but on the ATO website, they list 3 factors which determine whether you are a not-for-profit, and that then attracts certain tax concessions. So the first is the objects clause, which can be for anything other than operating for the profit of individual members. And related to that is the no distribution to members clause. So if the association does make a profit at the end of the year, it obviously cannot pay dividends back to the members. It has to reinvest that profit or that surplus back into achieving its objects. The third is upon winding up, and if there's money left over, then those surplus assets have to be transferred to another not-for-profit. It cannot go back to the membership. So that's what it means to be not-for-profit. And as I mentioned, it is all about tax benefits. So this graph is a little bit complicated, but I'll just briefly talk to it. Typical membership associations would be income tax exempt on member profit under the principle of mutuality. So if they make a profit on non-member income, possibly that is taxable. Now, some not-for-profits are income tax exempt on all income, whether member or non-member. And those not-for-profits include charities registered with the ACNC. So all charities are income tax exempt. As well, there are certain categories under the Tax Act where organisations can self-assess as being income tax exempt. And for most agricultural organisations, there's a category called resource development organisations, and you might fall under that category. And then there's also FBT and GST tax benefits. And then if the organisation is extra special, it might have DGR status, which means deductible gift recipient status. So these organisations can receive donations and the donor can claim that donation as a tax deduction.
It's very important there, Kathy, to pick up on the FBT exemptions, because if you are an organisation that has that FBT exemption, some of your staff might have benefits, whether they're salary packaging, motor vehicles and those sorts of things. So it's very worth checking in case your staff would be relevant and applicable to those benefits.
Okay, so as an association board, you don't need to know, the very complicated not-for-profit tax landscape, but what you do need to know is what is our organisation's tax status. And the ATO recommends an annual review by the board, and they do provide worksheets that you can work through. All right, so as I mentioned, bylaws support the Constitution and they can be made and changed by the board. So the matters to go in the bylaws are those that does not require to be in the Constitution. Mechanics of the organisation that change and evolve frequently, such as membership fees. And then you might have in there the processes around your elections, the more prescriptive details, how committees are appointed and operate, policy and budgeting process, and so on. Now, the governance charter or board charter, every year the board should reaffirm in writing how it will operate. And these are some of the things that I mentioned before. And at Associations Forum, we do have a template board charter. So if anyone is interested, feel free to email me and I'll send you a copy. And I believe it will also be available via the AgriFutures website later on. Okay, so looking at board composition, who should be on a board? This is determined by the Constitution, and it's usually an election process via the membership electing the directors. We usually recommend that if there is an election, that the ballot is held before the AGM, and then you announce the results at the AGM. If members come from the same background, having independent directors may be appropriate. So we are seeing associations update their constitutions to provide for the option of appointing 1 or 2 extra directors who aren't elected and who are not necessarily from the membership. Some national associations have a director from every state and territory, which reflects our federated structure in Australia, and other associations elect directors from the membership at large. Now, at Associations Forum, we've been conducting our board survey for a number of years. So I just want to share with you some trends and statistics. There's a lot of numbers on this, but I'll talk to it. The first trend we're seeing is around board meetings. So the average number of meetings total per year is falling. So in 2010, it was 9 board meetings a year, and this year it was 7. Related to board meetings is number of face-to-face meetings. So in 2008, the average number of face-to-face meetings was 7. And then this year and last year was 3, obviously because of COVID. But pre-COVID, it was 5. So average number of board meetings per year overall is falling. And so is the average board size. So in 2008, the average association board size was 11. And this year it's 9. Every year we ask what is the ideal number of directors, and participants basically just put in a number. So this year the most common response was 9, followed by 8. So that aligns with the average association board size. There were a couple of outliers. A couple of people wrote 20, not sure why, and then a couple of people wrote 0. So the running joke in our office is that the zeros are disgruntled CEOs. But we agree with this statistic and also with the average board size. So it's all to do with group dynamics. There's a lot of studies in the corporate sector about, ideal board size. But in the not-for-profit sector, you need a board that is large enough that you are able to get all the, skills and perspectives and knowledge that you need, as well as being broadly reflective of your membership. And also it needs to be large enough that you have enough directors to do the work that's required. But balancing that against a board that is small enough that there is efficient decision making. So obviously with the larger board, it is harder to facilitate discussions and come to a decision. And also that's small enough that allows for the relationships between directors to develop and increase engagement of the individual directors. What we mean by that is if there is a large board, for example, if there is a board of 20, you'll often see a lot of apologies because it's easier to miss a board meeting. Your presence will not be missed as much. And also just to do with the logistics of organising a board meeting for 20 people as opposed to 9 or 10 people. So some more stats from our survey. 75% of associations would have the board elect the president or the chair, and 25% have the membership do that. So we would agree with these stats because the board is in a better position to know who would be a good president or chair. If you let the membership do it, they're less likely to know who would be a good president. And also, and it can become a little bit of a popularity contest. Overwhelmingly, 90% of associations would not have the CEO as a member of the board. And again, we agree with this because the CEO is accountable and reports to the board. They shouldn't be a member of the board. Another interesting trend we're seeing over the years is associations paying their directors. So at the moment, it's only 16%. And you can only pay your directors if it's provided for in your constitution. And of those that pay, the median remuneration for a director is $4,000 and for a president is $21,000. Okay. So succession planning is an important role of the board. This is because associations are people dependent. So that, for example, if there is reliance on a very active president who does most of the work, is the association equipped to deal with that should that president then move on? If you're fortunate enough to have a CEO, then sudden departure of a CEO is a more significant issue, but for most emerging industries, this may not be as relevant as you're just starting out. Okay, Steve.
Thanks, Kathy. So just touching on some of the skills required at board level, as we've talked about, governance understanding is critical, and that's part of today's session, ensuring people get some good governance training. Interesting enough, we're doing some work in the registered organisation space, and it's mandatory for a director to have governance training within 6 months of appointment. So that's the sort of pressure that's coming from government organisations. Important that directors have some strategic initiatives and innovative skills, because then they'll advance the organisation, because the board is all about strategy, management is about operations. Importantly, they need to have some business acumen, and also it's quite good to have some expertise in the work of the members and really having an understanding of the membership base. As we've touched on, financial abilities are important, particularly in declaration of solvencies and also in just monitoring the organisation's cash flow. Knowledge and experience with relevant legislation, that emphasis is really around some legal understanding or getting some of that advice. Risk management expertise is coming more and more critical, and that's in place with a lot of risk registers and the board regularly reviewing the risk register for new risks such as even COVID, what was identifying the risks with COVID and what actions could be taken quickly and efficiently. And importantly, with boards that interact with government, it's always important to have members that have some business and political acumen and have some relationships with the ministers that are relevant to maybe the industry. Also, with a number of announcements that organisations make, it's nice to have a public relations or a media person that can actually fine-tune some of those releases and help the chair with any media discussions. And lastly, it's important to have some links with the members of the organisation. Thanks. Yeah. So, ways to attract new members. Directors benefit themselves from personal training and development. So there is a lot of directors out there looking for their first step as a director. So it's important to actually attract those. The efficient structures within the organisation, that means really running board meetings on a timely basis, having relevant agendas, papers issued on a timely basis so directors get an opportunity to read them and review them. Because directors that want to come on boards also want to make sure that their time's used efficiently and effectively. Also, at the beginning of the process, it's important to stress the levels of commitment and limits on that commitment, and also the association plans, and that would be part of what the organisation is looking to do, not only next year, but in 3 to 5 years. Good briefing sessions for candidates are important because actually they pass that information on to other people that are looking for boards. Interesting enough, a good board induction process actually shows the director that you're interested in them and advancing their skills. So they actually will willingly accept a recommendation to be on the board. And lots of times it's also nice to acknowledge directors and thank them, even if it's only in the minutes or when you're with staff. It's actually quite good to actually acknowledge and introduce directors to staff because they feel part of the business and part of the strategy of the business. It's important that we move from a nomination type situation where anyone can apply. Directors still want to feel wanted and needed, and you should be very, very prudent about how you advertise for directors. Also, you should send a lot more information if you can on what the organisation's about, so the directors actually make a choice very early in the process, and you don't have a situation where you think you're going to be appointing a director and at the last minute they decline. Also, it's important to have a minimum number for a fixed term, and actually making sure the terms of directors actually are spaced out, so not a whole group of them finish their term at the same time, so you continue to remain a little bit of history within the organisation from continuing directors and past directors. The other thing we're noticing now is a lot more due diligence on incoming board members. There's obviously always the police checks and ASIC requirements, but organisations are starting to send out questionnaires and declarations, and particularly the declaration of any conflicts of interest, because that will show very early in the piece whether the organisation can accept that director and can work with those conflicts of interest, or if they're non-negotiable. Also, the other things that you would attach with that is obviously your most recent published financial statements for the director, any compliance or recommendations with ASIC, and discussions around the strengths and weaknesses of the CEO and the executive, so the director feels that there's a good support base there. As we've said, board induction and training is critical. We've actually been working ourselves at Association Forum and putting a pack together on inductions, and that's been very useful for new directors. In fact, previously, one of the directors we did in the induction process has actually used that for another organisation because they found that very useful. And I've also seen the opportunity where a director used the induction process to when they're attending a course as well and training. It's very important that during that induction process that you enable the incoming director to meet with the relevant members within the organisation. Obviously, the chair is the first one that they would actually be having a session with, but it's also important that they interact with the CEO, understand where the CEO is coming from and plans for the business, but other key executives, which might be the CFO, company secretary, if they is a separate role. Part of the organisation might have a marketing person, so they understand what the business is looking to do and grow into revenue streams. Very important that they actually meet with the appropriate people, and they also feel that they are able to contact those people, but usually via the CEO. And lastly, you should have an evaluation process of things that the new directors would comment on, and that would improve even more your induction process.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so moving on to board roles. Now, the decision-making roles within an association, the members actually play a limited role in governance. As you might remember Steve's definition of corporate governance in the beginning from the Cadbury report, they have what we call ultimate reserve powers. So day to day, they're not that involved with the governance, but if they're not happy, they can either change the constitution or not re-elect the directors. And in extreme circumstances, they can call a general meeting to remove directors. Okay, but the board has ultimate authority and responsibility, and the most important decision that boards would make is the hiring or the firing of the CEO. And once the CEO is employed, then they are tasked with making the decisions to achieve the plan and the budget. Now, I want to do a quick anonymous quiz. All right, so in an association, who leads the association? Is it the president, the CEO, the board, the members? Just share results. So we've got some mixed results, and the answer is it depends. Okay. So leadership, we got this from Wikipedia, by the way, is practical skill encompassing the ability of an individual to lead or guide other individuals. So we think it's a personal characteristic and not a set role. So in some associations, the president leads, and in other, the board leads, and in others, the CEO leads. And sometimes there's dual leadership between the CEO and the president. But regardless of who leads, an association is a group and not a vehicle for an individual. And ultimately, initiatives from a leader need board approval. So those associations that do have CEOs, it's important to understand the distinction between the two roles and who does what. So generally, the board decides what and the CEO decides how. And so with staffing, the board will evaluate the CEO and the CEO will be responsible for the rest of the staff. The board sets policies, the CEO implements policies. The board has compliance oversight, approves the budget, and the CEO usually develops the budget and reports against those items. Strategy is done differently depending on the association. For volunteer associations, obviously the board, has to develop the plan and also implement it. But when you do have a CEO, that might be a dual role, but then it's definitely the CEO's responsibility to implement the plan and to report to the board against that. The members limited role, as I said before, members must consent to join an association, so they cannot be deemed to be a member. Usually on joining, the members are asked to confirm that they agree to the constitution and any codes of conduct, etc. If it is a company limited by guarantee, then they have to agree to the guarantee amount, which is usually nominal, such as $1. Members cannot be sued as members if the association is incorporated. And members have no fiduciary or statutory duties, no conflicts of interest, and can act in their own interest subject to the objects and the constitution. All right. So another key role of the board is to ensure plans. The starting point for any plan is the objects clause in the constitution. Okay, so the board should focus on the mission, and we call it 5 to 9 pillars, which are like broad areas, and I'll show you an example in the next slide. When you know your plan and balance sheet, a budget can be developed. Association plans can be strategic plus operational. This is especially true for those organisations that are volunteer run. So they, don't really need to make that distinction between strategic and operational. We're not hung up on that. If something needs to be done, it should be written down in the plan. Make sure you refer to the plan in every board meeting. Plans need ownership by the board and the CEO, as well as other volunteers and staff should see where they fit in the plan and the budget. Major discussions should be by the board and not subcommittee, and plans should be specific and not general, not broad enough to do everything and yet nothing useful. So when we look at a plan, the best plans we see are those that, well, it's short, possibly plan on a page, and when we read it, we know exactly what the association is all about and what they're trying to achieve. Sometimes we see very, what we call wishy-washy plans, lots of blue sky statements, and it doesn't actually indicate what the association is going to do. And sometimes we see the opposite of that, in that it's too detailed. So, I've seen a plan that was, at least a dozen pages, but they, don't have the resources and the staff to achieve this very detailed plan. So we like practical, simple, straightforward plans. And I'm going to show you an example of the world's simplest plan. So you start with your mission. This is in this hypothetical association. The mission of XYZ association is to advance the XYZ industry and to represent the interests of members. And these are the pillars. In order to achieve our mission, we will, and there's 5 pillars: educate, inform, advocate, expand business opportunities, have good governance. And so this is the world's simplest plan. You have the pillars on the side, educate, and under educate you have the activities. So under educate, we're going to run a conference and provide online learning, and so for inform, advocate, expand, governance, etc.
Okay. We'll continue on now. So as we've touched on briefly at the beginning of the session, risk is critical to an organisation. If you don't have risk, but you don't have a business, so you still need to have risks, but you need to have actions to monitor them and address them as well. Obviously, the first important risk identification is on a legal basis by ensuring that your constitutional rules are regularly reviewed and updated. I've seen situations with associations where every year there's a piecemeal adjustment to the constitution, and it grows and grows over the years, but there's no overwhelming review of those constitutions. So as Kathy has touched on, it's worth getting the constitution reviewed. Associations Forum are actually involved in that space, and Kathy is directly involved in doing constitution reviews. So important at a certain stage to get those constitutions reviewed because they are the legal documents of your organisation. As we've touched on, strategy is so key to any organisation, and particularly in the directors space. Failing to address any strategic risks is actually the cause of a lot of downfall of organisations. As we'll touch on further on, establishing a risk register, which is then split up into strategic risks and operational risks, is important for managing any business. With strategic risks, it's recommended that you don't have too many of those. You have 4 or 5, and they're the direct responsibility of the directors, with the CEO and management implementing actions to address those strategic risks. Within the operational section of the risks, they might be 10 or 12 because they're running the business, and they will usually fall to management. We're under the direction and review and regular review, usually via the Audit and Risk Committee, of those risks. So strategic risks might be things around strategy of growing the revenue base, growing the business. Operational risks might be work health and safety issues and getting in place plans to address any of the, if you like, HR issues or anything like that. As we've touched on, the Audit and Risk Committee or Finance Audit and Risk Committee is important for resolving any risks and reporting back to the board on risks. As its title shows, it's important that all risks are identified and reported on, and usually that's on a quarterly basis with the Audit and Risk Committee. And that's a key function of that Audit and Risk Committee. Establishing diversity is key to identifying and getting risks under control. So if you have got one revenue source, particularly in the COVID environment, as we've seen with lots of organisations relying on events which were not held because they were face-to-face, they had to seek other revenue items and items that could actually be income into their organisation. The other key risks, and that's been identified in some of those cases that we showed early in the piece, particularly Surf Lifesaving, is having the financial controls and delegations in place. So you know exactly who was able to authorise and make payments, and ensuring there's adequate delegation so that people are not just approving their own expenses or anything like that. Importantly is the cyber risk. Organisations need to be aware that there is a tax on their controls and systems, and in getting in place enough control in that space that they won't be taken down by the IT systems being under threat. Poor operations and procedures, particularly in the work health and safety space, are a thing that needs to be monitored by the board and actually implemented and items put in place to address those. Likewise, any people issues or harassment or gender diversity issues should be part of a risk process, and ensuring that the organisation is aware of what's happening within the business. So the directors have a responsibility to ask management about various processes. As we've touched on, not only is there a cyber risk with IT, but there's also the risk of business continuity and disaster recovery. So if there's an accident or an incident at the organisation, how does the business continue? Also, business continuity probably needs to be looked at in the space of how do people operate from working from home as against in the office, because that's been a very big risk for organisation that they can actually continue to function. The reputation of the organisation is key, and the reputation is very important for stakeholders, for sponsorship, and also political reasons, because if the reputation is tarnished, you might have political impacts as well. As we've touched on, one of the important strategy risks is making sure you don't lose your membership base and what you're doing to actually grow that membership base. It's not only important to just have a risk register, but regularly updated. And that's not just a paper exercise. It's actually looking at what things you'll do to address those risks and the timing of implementation of actions to address those risks. A number of organisations have a risk register where it just rolls over every year. What you need to make sure is that those risks are relevant and actionable. And obviously the other risk is competitors coming into your space. Thanks, Kathy. Okay, risks and responsibilities have been far and away more enhanced by COVID. As we've touched on the risk register, probably the very first strategy risk is COVID. How did you address COVID and what steps you're taking in there? Obviously, the solvency is key to and close to the heart of each director. With COVID, it's also seen on a number of boards that there's much more emphasis on providing cash flows at each board meeting, and also providing estimates of your cash flow and your finishing position for profit for the end of the year, financial year. So with COVID, there has actually been a lot more reporting in the finance space, and board members asking for not only what's happened on an actual basis, what's happened and what will happen on a forecast basis. Some of the strategy plans that were commenced at the beginning of COVID commencing have been completely changed. So there's a lot of it needs to address and update those strategy plans. The other thing that we've noticed when we've run sessions on COVID and addressing the COVID issues has been ensuring that insurances are in place. With the number of staff working from home, you have equipment at home and in the office, and you also have staff susceptible to any injuries. So there's actually a very important work health and safety review required and insurance coverage required, because you're moving equipment between the business and home, and you need to be aware of any insurance increases that need to be put in place to cover those things. Also, current contracts. In the past, prior to COVID, you would probably have more meetings with suppliers regularly in the office and or on site. Those meetings will now be over a Zoom basis and not as frequent sometimes. So it's also important to ensure that current contracts are being regularly updated and nothing lapses that you become out of contract. We've talked about obligations under Fair Work, ensuring that your staff and everything are covered. And also we've touched on a little bit regarding people working from home. You need to make sure some organisations are requesting staff to send a photo in of their workplace and station, or complete forms detailing what things they have in place ergonomically to help with any back issues or seating arrangements. And also, because COVID has gone for a really significant period of time, a lot of organisations ask for that information at the beginning of staff going home. We've also found staff have changed residencies because people that are renting have moved into different locations, or they've actually moved in relatives and families. So it's actually a good time to check that work health and safety issues that were in place previously are in place now with different locations. Also, the other thing is ensuring that understanding what COVID impacts will have on your fee basis. There might be different situations where you might have a pause on fees or actually have a reduction to try and maintain the members. And last thing is obviously, how do you hold AGMs and other meetings adhering to the legal requirements? Fortunately, the government has issued some relief in holding AGMs via Zoom or other methods, even though they weren't in the Constitution originally. But I stress that everyone's Constitution should be reviewed to ensure that they can have meetings via not only a show of hands, but having them via Zoom and other means. Interesting enough, when people assume a board as a not-for-profit or association director, they need to be aware they're broadly the same as any for-profit organisation. there is often less resources, and they actually sometimes might be asked to participate in a number of more committees to help the organisation, because it's run on quite often on a volunteer basis. And that might be committees that were on governance, not only just the Audit and Risk Committee, but there might be other committees that you'll be asked to participate in. So it's very important that you be aware that your obligations may change because of the resourcing requirements. Also, the other part is that actually is more interesting in lots of cases. The organisation is driven and initially set up by a group of people who have a common interest or bond, and it's not all driven about profit or making a profit. So you actually might enjoy it more than just a pure corporate situation. And usually there's no major remuneration or contribution to the directors, apart from, you should always ensure that directors are fully remunerated for any expenses they incur on behalf of the organisation, so they're not out of pocket, but not excessively remunerated. With the board meetings, there's importance to have obviously any decisions minuted. We've seen lots of big cases where there hasn't been enough information of what was discussed. It's a very big balancing act between how much information and to include and how much to exclude. It's important that you actually provide enough information to provide the reasoning for those decisions to be made. And obviously, when you actually, the board decides on a particular decision, they need to propose a formal motion. Even though now proposing a seconding is not required at board meetings, they might add some clarity to the decision, and it depends on the chair or the organisation itself whether they want to have proposing a seconding. But it's very important that the motion is listed and explained exactly as each director assumed it would be. So if there is a requirement to go back and look at how that motion was worded and how the action was implemented, you actually have a consistency. Obviously, where board meetings will have different discussions happening, and it's not a bad thing to have debate and interaction of board members, because you don't want to just have one type of common experience and understanding. It's important that directors provide opinions and provide different alternatives. But once that discussion has occurred, and the chair is important in making sure that there's robust discussion, but not excessive discussion, the board makes a decision in a solidarity type situation where the decision made is on the whole of the board. If directors still disagree with those decisions, they can ask for the minutes to reflect that the fact that they abstained from the decision, or even they actually disagreed with the decision. And if the director even feels even stronger with that decision, the director may be able to resign because his position is quite adverse to the organisation. With the structuring of minutes, it's very important to show who attended the minutes, because that might become important when deciding on what decisions were made and who was in the board meeting, the date and the timing of the decisions. It must be logical what's included in the minutes. It shouldn't be used as a political avenue for a director to have comments throughout the minutes of the board meeting. The minutes should be concise and accurate, as I said, to explain how decisions were made and how the meeting progressed. And they should also be a reflection of how the agenda was issued to directors before the meeting, and should follow the agenda as much as possible. Minutes are not verbatim. Minutes are actually an accurate reflection of discussions. If you can do minutes via a recording, but there's pros and cons in doing that. Some directors will refuse to have minutes recorded because they want to ensure there is robust discussion, and they believe that if minutes are recorded, that might deter or may result in some directors refraining from discussion. They are private. Minutes shouldn't be released to your members unless there is a reason to release them, and directors should be aware that those minutes are confidential and not to be made available to the public. The other important fact is also making sure that your minutes and your board papers and your agenda have the right security around them. We've seen organisations go to immense lengths to have security around those situations and then just email them out a copy. And the copy of the minutes is not password protected. So those minutes, if they're in an email, could be forwarded on for a particular avenue of a director if they were engaging in that. So it's important that you actually make sure everything is kept private and confidential, and how you store your minutes, your board papers, and any details that are relevant to the organisation. As I've said, the company has to demonstrate the minutes are a correct record. We've seen the cases with Catherine Livingston, a very high-profile director, who assumed certain things were in the minute regarding questions she asked during a board meeting. They weren't reflected in the minutes, and ASIC was actually then able to prove that despite her discussions occurring, they weren't included in the relevant decision-making. Yep. Usually in board meetings, you'll have a chair or a president residing over those meetings, and that'll be both at board meetings and general meetings. The chair is very important to ensure that they are experienced enough to make sure the meeting flows, and when to slow down or when to speed up, depending on the decisions that need to be made and how much detail to go in. The chair obviously needs to be actually representative of the other directors and make sure the directors have a level of respect to the chair, and it's important they don't talk over the chair and provide the right level of support for the CEO, who the chair should work in unison with. When you actually do an AGM, it's quite critical that the chair has a step-by-step run sheet or script, and also has advice on what issues or items will come up during the AGM. And usually what organisations do is do some sample questions that might be raised and the answers to those questions. So in the AGM, it's all about preparation and also providing script sheets for the CEO, if the CEO is going to be talking at the AGM, or any other relevant executives. And to make sure that the AGM runs as smooth as possible, the chair would usually do a run through prior to that meeting. With respect to board meetings, agendas need to be clear and concise, and ensure that they're actually complementary to the plan that was established, and make reference to the plans that were established at the beginning of the year, so the organisation has information of how they're performing against those plans. They require board discussion and decision, and then you need to avoid anything coming up or from previous meetings. Usually when a board meeting finishes with the last meeting, you should carry it over into the next meeting. With respect to agendas, usually the CEO and the chair would meet together to establish the agenda, and sometimes organisation might ask other directors for input into the agendas. Okay, subject close to my heart as a CFO in finance. So often people refer to associations as not-for-profit and regard profit as a bad word. It's really important to establish the fact that in achieving a surplus or a profit is not bad news. Lots of organisations are really reluctant to increase their surplus because they think that members' monies need to be spent in that particular year. With the COVID situation, I think it was very important that organisations did have a surplus, because they might have needed to do extra items because they don't have particular events occurring, or their membership base might have been decreased. As we've said, reserves should never be distributed to members. Organisations can't pay dividends, and directors should receive reimbursements for reasonable expenses consistent with not only the Constitution, but their appointment letters. When you appoint a director, it should be very clear what is reimbursable and what is not reimbursable, and the ability of directors to go and seek additional advice and how that is actually delegated. So if directors wish to get some finance or legal advice on behalf of the board, there should be a process on how that is approved and how that is monitored. As we've said, financial reserves are important not only for COVID, but any future shocks or growth that might be needed in the future. So if you're looking to do a big marketing campaign, it's good to have a little bit of a surplus to put money towards that. Or if you're entering into a large computer IT program or a membership database, it's good to have the resources put aside in prior years to address those, rather than trying to fund those in one particular year. As we've said, during this COVID period, it's been very important to diversify incomes, and organisations have been very clever in how they do those diversifications. Number of organisations during COVID. One organisation I've heard of is developing masks and gone into industry of masks. Another one is doing the screens for the bank teller type screens, putting those in place in supermarkets and shopping centres, which they'd never done in the past. And finally, the budgets that were set at the beginning of the year need to be reviewed on a regular basis and linked back against the plans. With lots of organisations, during the year, you'll have a budget which is updated to a full year forecast to ensure that you've got the reliable information. But you should also keep the budgets initially that were developed and signed off on, so you have a history of where you've come from when you finish the particular year. And based on a lot of these things, having in place, associations do not normally go broke, which is a great message. Not only are you working for an association that has good governance, you need to make sure that your organisation has good financial reporting, which is timely and accurate. If you go to a board meeting and the financial reports are not available at that board meeting, or provided only a day before the board meeting, that is not really good for director review. And as a director, you would be actually asking some questions to the management of the organisation, because you need to have, as we said, time to review and ask relevant questions on data that has been received via financial reports. The financial reports themselves don't need to be in-depth on every minor and minute item. They should be regarded as being in place for material items. So if you receive a finance report that says you spent $10 on flowers, it's probably not relevant as spending $100,000 on a new computer IT system and understanding how that IT implementation is going. So the stress is in making sure that your finance reports provide enough information to understand how the organisation is being managed on a finance basis and what shape financially the organisation is in. Usually look at any variances that you receive against revenue and expense items that are material to the organisation. And that might be 10 or 20% movement against your original budget or against last year's costs or revenue. The other item that's quite important that's putting in place is activity-based costing or cost center reporting. So if you have a particular department, say a marketing department, it's good to actually consolidate and report on how the marketing department is achieving its marketing goals and how much money has been spent on that marketing cost center, as distinct by having it just lumped into a total number. Lots of organizations in the past have reported they've run an event, and because they employed one marketing person to run an event, they showed that it was quite profitable, but they needed to take into account some of the indirect costs of other employees that actually helped in that marketing event. And that would be a true reflection of the cost of running the event and helps them budget for the next year of, say, that marketing event as well. As we said, all staff costs should actually be allocated to the relevant cost center. And if you can't accurately allocate them, sometimes it's good to have at least an estimate of those costs so you can actually understand what the full cost of any particular project is. Obviously, profit results need to be in sufficient detail in both revenue and expense items. So the important revenue items would obviously be membership and sponsorship in some cases. And the expense items usually would have a significant portion of employee costs, as well as some of the marketing or membership fee costs. So important that you actually do a budget for the beginning of the year. You provide forecasts at least at the half yearly mark, and you compare them as you go throughout the year, at least against actuals versus budgets or actuals versus budgets and previous year, and explain material variances. You're not interested in the immaterial ones, but you need to know what the material ones, because that could be a first hit spotlight on what could be coming at the organisation in the remaining months of the year. As I've said, cash flow forecasts, which were not as important in previous reporting of associations and not always listed alongside the balance sheet and profit and loss, are regularly now included in board papers, because organisations want to know what their cash position is now, what it will be in a few months, what it will be by the end of the year. So it's important that the cash flow forecast is provided to the board on a regular basis. Also, the other part is with board members, they would like to receive as well some non-financial information, and that might be number of new members, any sponsorship increases, and membership retention percentages. As a lot of board members may not be actually financially inclined to receive information in tables, sometimes it's good to actually put graphs showing those results, because a picture paints is better than 1,000 words sometimes. Importantly, with an association, as Kathy said, it starts off with volunteers. There's a growth stage, and usually there's employment of staff. And as maturity comes, it becomes with financial strength. And then you start to report management, appoint management, such as CEOs or chief of staff. Associations will continue an ongoing situation, and they're a very good organisation for be on a board, because they're actually usually commenced because there's actually a need or reason to have those associations in place. So as we've touched on, it's very important to have good governance. I won't go through too much of this because we've touched on it, but incoming directors obviously should be provided with the right information, and that will be plans before they take the directorship. They should be encouraged to ask difficult questions and not go into a group think situation and thinking that another director has that area covered or has that expertise. Particularly in some organisations in the old days of a treasurer, where a director was named as a treasurer, everything on finance, all the directors looked towards the treasurer every time there was a question. Treasurer, the person that previously was a treasurer, has the same responsibilities as every other board member to ask any questions, particularly on finance. If all directors should ask questions rather than assume everything's right and correct. And when they come on board, there will be times when there will be dips in the organisation or associations, as we've seen with membership changes, but they need to be vigilant about how those issues will be addressed. They should always hold the CEO accountable, and the CEO obviously should present at each and every board meeting. And also it's a good thing actually if you have other staff to actually engage those and bring them into board meetings if the topic is relevant. Say, for instance, if you're doing a marketing program, you might have the marketing representative of the organisation come in to present, so the board members get an involvement with that marketing person, and also that provides succession planning as well sometimes. And always the members should hold the board to account. Okay. Important, although we said board members come on board in volunteer organisations, you should ensure that the board work is not overwhelming to board members. And importantly, you need to have this differentiation between board members being ultimately responsible for the strategy of the organisation, where management is responsible for the operations of the organisation. Also, the other part that's important in the charter or in the correspondence is a clear understanding of who can comment in the press. Lots of organisation, they make it that the chair or president is the only one allowed to actually report to media or provide press statements. In the day and age now, we have a different sets of communication. It's very important to agree with board members of who makes relevant comments and the type and context of those comments. these are just items that we've talked about that tie into the cases we've had, scandal and frauds, often by a person you trust. So it's actually making sure that you have the checks and balances, you have regular reporting, and as we've said, delegations level, where people are not signing off on their own expenses, but there is a true level of supervision. And obviously, if you have the wrong person as CEO, you should address that very quickly rather than letting it continue on. And that applies to any other key employees that the CEO is managing. You should actually, although you won't decide on their employment, you should always be aware of what the strengths and weaknesses of the organisation are just below the CEO. And lastly, as we said, if you can't get an answer on some of the questions, or you're not professionally qualified in that area, you should seek professional advice, whether it's finance or legal, on a basis if you need it. Again, this is a summary of all the things that we've gone through today. I won't go through each and every one, but if anyone has any questions on those, happy to take them on board. Did you have any other comments, Kat?
Rob has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Rob.
About 2 slides back, the last question about if you get that advice. You're not seeking professional advice when required. So it seems that whenever you really have a problem with a board, that you have to spend actually a lot of time and money of your own.
No, that's not your time and money. Let's be very clear. Very clear. Time maybe. In your delegations level, you should have a delegation available where, if required, directors can seek advice up to a certain amount, and that might be, say, whether it's $1,000 or $5,000. Over and above that amount, they need the approval of the CEO or the board as a whole. And as we've said, if you've got a board membership that turns over, you actually will be able to get that through a board. If you've got a board that is not turning over, that would make it very difficult.
Rob, I'll just clarify, this is not about individual directors seeking advice. This is about a board seeking advice when required. Yeah. And I can give you a couple of examples. So we were working with an association that wanted to merge with another association, and the board went ahead and proceeded with the merger process, but because they didn't get the right advice, they decided to do it themselves, and they didn't follow the correct technical process. So the merger, couldn't happen. Like, for example, the wording of the resolutions or the notice of meeting, so it's not always big legal pieces of advice. It could just be understanding your knowledge limitations and ensuring that something as big as a merger is fairly important. And if we're a board of teachers or doctors, what do we know about mergers? So maybe we should go and get some external advice about that.
Okay.
Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, so if anyone's got any issues or questions on that, certainly Kathy and myself are happy to come back to you.